Okay, sorry. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Blessed Trinity, once again we come before your presence, asking your guidance and your inspiration to bless this day for us, that we may live it according to your divine will. Inspire us, Lord, to delve deeply into these issues of human life, bioethical issues at the end of human life, specifically today with nutrition and hydration, and all the bioethical decisions that need to be made around this topic. We pray in a very special way for all those who are in most need of your divine mercy at this time. In the name of Christ, our Lord. Amen. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Well, welcome back. This course of the bioethics of at the end of human life within the program of bioethics. And we want to first, if there are any questions or comments from previous lectures, no? We're ready to start then. Let me get a little paper here. Okay, then just briefly a review from the previous lectures, that the determination of death is a moment, it's a clinical event, all right? And the Catholic Church accepts what the doctors say with regards to the declaration of death, and also the legal system follows that same thought. So today there are two determinations of death: the traditional one, the classical determination of death, which is no heartbeat and no breathing. Okay, it's called the cardiopulmonary criterion. And then the other one, the newer one, if you will, is the neurological criterion, which is total brain death. And I've emphasized before that includes the brainstem also, because of the involuntary functions of the body that are also vital functions. All right, so just reinforcing that everyone, at least in this country, they're all on the same page, the law, the medical profession, and thanks be to God, the Catholic Church, on total brain death. The other issue that we had talked about is ordinary and extraordinary means of life support with regards to the bioethical analysis, whereby ordinary means of life support obligate morally, ethically, whereas extraordinary means of life support do not necessarily obligate. A person may do them if they want to, or the family or friends, whoever is in charge, but they don't obligate morally. Okay, so ordinary and extraordinary means of life support, a crucial distinction there bioethically. And sometimes that distinction doesn't match necessarily what the medical profession does, because the medical profession is looking at it from standard protocols, standard clinical protocols versus experimental procedures. So I've mentioned that a procedure that may be a standard medical protocol may be considered extraordinary means for this particular patient in his or her estimation, okay? An excessive burden, if you will. So there's a big subjective element there that needs to be respected. I'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into this topic today. The other crucial distinction between assisting or substituting vital organs, I find that to help a lot, especially at times when the death process is subtle but has already begun. In other words, where vital organs are failing irreversibly, all right? Then there is an obligation to assist the person and assisting those vital organs in the death process, but there's no obligation to substitute vital organs when they are failing irreversibly. that presupposes that we can identify the vital organs and their proper function and so forth. All right. So any questions on that or comments? People are clear? Yeah? Okay. Let's move forward now into this topic of nutrition and hydration. And it will be a two-part. The first part, hello, Henry, the two handouts over there. Yep. The first part is going to be all the theory, if you will, the analysis, the bioethical analysis of nutrition and hydration. When does it obligate? When does it not obligate? And then the second part of today's lecture will be a case study. We'll look at the case of Terri Schiavo, okay, which was extremely difficult and sad and important, and it went on in our own state. All right, so let's continue forward then on nutrition and hydration. Cure and care. So a patient becomes a patient because she or he has something wrong with them, all right? They're ill, either physically or mentally, or sometimes both together. And so the medical profession seeks to cure. And there is a standard procedure. The first thing that the medical profession does is to try to establish a diagnosis. In other words, what is wrong with this patient? Why is this patient a patient, right? It could be physical or it could be mental or both, but there's a healing profession for that. So that's the first step, to see if there's a cure for that particular diagnosis. And so there will be a clinical protocol to follow. And once the diagnosis is established, then depending on what protocol, the severity of the illness, then the prognosis, which is the hope of recovery. Okay, so the diagnosis is the current illness of the person, and the prognosis is the hope of recovery. Sometimes medicine runs out, goes to its limit, and there's no more cure. Okay, there's no more cure. And you can understand that that is dependent on many, many factors. Where we are in the world, how severe the illness is, what are the resources available, et cetera, et cetera. Many, many circumstances fall into the limit of cure. But at some point, medicine has its own limits, right? Then there is the other issue of care, because cure may not obligate, because there may not be a cure, or that is the end of the line. For example, the typical case is with cancer, terminal cancer, there's no more cure. The patient cannot be healed with the medicine that is available today. And even though there have been tremendous advances, medicine has its own limits, right? How about care? Okay, care always obligates. Care always obligates morally, ethically, all right? It obligates for normal life, and it obligates, in a sense, even more so when people are ill, because they are more vulnerable and they're more dependent on others. So then we have to look at care. And we can summarize it at least 4 fundamental aspects of basic care, which you can see are needed for maintaining life: nutrition, hydration, shelter, and human interaction, some kind of human contact, all right? So food, water, shelter, not being exposed out to the elements, and also the human care is a very important aspect of our living, because we should not be deprived of that human care. It's a basic need that we all have. With regards to nutrition and hydration, typically they're seen together in the medical profession, but not necessarily, all right? Because if we analyze them a little bit, we reflect a little bit, we can last longer without nutrition than we can without hydration, all right? We can go without food for a longer time, physically speaking, than we can go without water. For example, a person could go almost for a month without eating, depending on how well nourished they are when they started the diet or the fasting or the, what is that called? When it's used in protest, okay, starvation, fasting or diet. Because the body goes into self-consumption. In other words, the basic elements, most of the basic elements that the body needs, the body also has incorporated into our tissue, mostly into the muscle tissue. And so the cells, the muscle cells, go into self-consumption. Enzymes are released that start digesting first the fat, then the muscle. And so a person can go literally down to what we call skin and bones, right? Because most of the other tissues are consumed in an effort to maintain vital function going and the minimal calories necessary for maintaining life. So we can go much longer without nutrition, whereas hydration, on average, 3 to 4 days without water will shut down the kidneys, okay? And the person will dehydrate to death. So we dehydrate much before we starve to death. And that's why that could be critical at some point with regards to a person. If the person cannot be nourished anymore, at least hydrated is the very bare minimum on a day-to-day basis, sometimes even on an hour-to-hour basis, if they are toward the end of their life. Okay, so let's go forward now. When the person is no longer able to swallow, right, or is having difficulty swallow, we're talking about in the context of the end of life. It could be because of an accident or it could be because of illness. But the point is that now we have a patient that is having more and more difficulty in swallowing, in ingesting food or hydration or water, or when they swallow, they start choking, aspiration. In other words, some of the water or the food is going to the lungs. That can cause what is known as aspiration pneumonia, which is very dangerous. They end up in the intensive care unit. They may have to be intubated for aspiration pneumonia. So the first thing that is done is a swallow test. This is done quite routinely in nursing homes, for example, and hospitals when people have difficulty swallowing. It's a swallow test, okay? If the person does not pass a swallow test, including thickened water. Have you ever heard about thickened water? Yes, water can be thickened, right, with some, I think it's like a starch.
Like a gel?
Sorry?
Like a gel?
Like a gel, yes,
Yeah, gel.
exactly, so that it's easier for people to swallow and it doesn't go into the trachea, into the lungs, all right? So thickened water is an alternative for people who have, especially the elderly, who have difficulty swallowing. Also, they tend to dehydrate, the throat tends to dehydrate and it's more difficult. The thing about swallowing is that, you know, it's a learned behavior. Swallowing is a learned behavior, but it's not considered a basic, the throat itself is not considered a vital organ, okay? So swallowing is a learned behavior, and sometimes the elderly and the very elderly forget to swallow. And they'll have the food in the mouth and they'll chew it, or they may not chew it, and it's just sitting there. And they don't know what to do with it because they forgot. And this happens at times with dementia or Alzheimer's. They just forget to swallow and they'll have the food in their mouth, and the people, the caretakers, especially the third-party caretakers, become kind of exasperated and they move on to the other patient, and then that can cause problems because if they swallow the wrong way, it can go into the trachea, into the lungs, and cause, like I said, this aspiration pneumonia. All right, so if the person does not pass a swallow test for whatever reason, then is that like, okay, better than having it flip back and forth? Unless we can take turns moving if you want to take turns on the exercise. But if it's not one thing, it's another. Okay. So we need to go into medically assisted nutrition and hydration, okay? Medically assisted nutrition and hydration when the person cannot swallow on their own. So somehow we have to bypass the swallowing process, the throat. So there are two basic options available to medicine. It is what is known as enteral nutrition or parenteral nutrition. Okay, enteral nutrition is using the enteric system, which is the intestinal system, the stomach and the intestines. Okay, if the GI tract is intact, the gastrointestinal tract, the GI tract is intact, all right, or functioning, then it will be enteral nutrition. Again, enteric is a reference to the GI tract. Let me put that here. GI tract, which is the gastrointestinal system, all right? Stomach and intestines. But if there is a problem with the GI tract, either at the stomach or at the intestinal level, from an illness or disease or damage or an accident, okay, then the GI tract has to be bypassed, and then it becomes parenteral. And parenteral is a reference to the circulatory system, essentially. So go in through the veins, feeding the person directly by a line. Okay, a line is essentially a port into the venous system, into some major vein of the body, which bypasses the gastrointestinal system and will feed the person directly. Okay, we'll look at it in more details, including some diagrams. So let's move on for a moment. All right, so enteral nutrition is feeding by a tube. And again, there are two major ways, ports of entry, either through the nose, the tube down to the stomach, or if the stomach is diseased or injured, bypassing the stomach all the way down into the intestines, all right? And that's typically the NG tube, nasogastric tube, is to the stomach, gastric reference to the stomach. So the NG tube, nasogastric tube, is to the stomach. And if the stomach needs to be bypassed, then it's a nasojejunal tube or an NJ tube, a little less common, but also used. Okay, again, going through the nose, relatively medium-sized tube actually, flexible, goes through the nose all the way down through the esophagus, either down to the stomach or down to the intestines, okay? To the jejunum, which is the opening of the section between the stomach and the small intestine. And food, nutrition, and hydration together in the same mix can be pushed down that tube. If for some reason it is impossible to intubate the person through the nose because maybe the head region is not available, the nasal region is not available for whatever reason, then a tube directly to the stomach, right? A tube to the stomach, known as a percutaneous endoscopic gastrostomy, also known as the PEG, the famous PEG tube. All right?
So they go through a process to see which is the best way?
Yes, exactly, depending on what's available. And they're listed.
That's a sequence?
And that is a sequence. That is also the sequence if the nose is available and the patient can tolerate this to the stomach, but the stomach is still digesting, right? The stomach is functioning, and the lower GI, in other words, the intestines, are also functioning. They'll go to the stomach. If for some reason the stomach is not digesting, maybe it's ulcerated or maybe has cancer, then they bypass the stomach with the tube and go directly into the intestines, all right? But if for some reason the upper GI tract, in other words, from the stomach up, esophagus and the whole mouth, the throat region and the nose is for whatever reason not available, then they have to go directly into the stomach. There's another tube actually that is a tube directly to the intestines, and I'll show you that in the diagram in a minute. So there are several options that the doctors have, but these are the most common, and the two most common are the NG tube and the PEG. Those are the two most common ones, okay? Sometimes you may have seen it. You may have seen a patient at a hospital who has a tube through the nose, and it causes impact because the blend that is typically put through that tube is either a brownish color or a greenish color, all right? Because it will have vegetables in it, fibers. They just take food and mash it into, blend it into the blender, you know, pureed, and that's pushed down with water, very hydrated, pushed down. But that's essentially what the mastication process would do. Mastication is the chewing process. When we put food in our mouth and water, let's say, is theoretically all together, and we grind it, what we swallow is what they would put down the tube. Okay, so it's a little impressive. It's a fairly large tube, and you see either a brownish paste or a greenish paste going down the nose of this individual that's going all the way down into the stomach or the intestines. All right, so let's look at the entry ports here a little bit. So there are these categories. These are through the nose, the tubes through the nose, depending on where they land, either at the stomach or if they continue down into the intestines. And then the other one is the PEG here, okay, going, and it's called percutaneous because it goes through the integument. Cutaneous is a reference to the skin. Cuticle is the skin, all right? And percutaneous means that it goes through the skin. So essentially, it's a little hole. It's minor surgery, and it's a little hole that is made on the side of the abdomen. And then on the inside, there has to be a concomitant hole on the inside of the stomach also to connect. And then the doctors put, it's like almost like two little umbrellas on each side. You've seen those little Chinese umbrellas that you get on the Chinese restaurant that open up like that? Okay, well, it's similar to that, but it would have a hole in between, and it's on both sides. So they put it closed on either side, and then they open it up and clamp them together. So it forms essentially a tube, a hole. And then through there goes the tube itself. On the inside, it's emptying, like I say, either on their stomach or further down into the intestines. On the outside, at the opposite end of the PEG, there will be like a large bore syringe. Right? On the large bore syringe, you pour in there the shake of whatever food is made, all mashed, and there's a plunger, and you just plunge it down slowly but surely until it's all pushed into the stomach. Okay? The patient feels essentially nothing other than the stomach getting filled with food. All right, so it's done by dosage and slowly but surely, consistently. And with the PEG, people can be kept essentially indefinitely, especially if they are in PVS, all right? If they are in vegetative state, they're just being fed and their basic metabolism is kept. Okay, so this is enteral access, and it's fairly benign. As invasive as it may seem, the NG tube is typically temporary. All right, the NG tube is temporary because in the long run, it tends to irritate the nose and the throat, and it can get infected also. So typically the NG tube is temporary for some condition that can be overcome in, let's say, an average of a couple of weeks. But if the patient needs to be intubated for longer for food, then the PEG is the indication, the proper indication. So the PEG is more permanent than the NG tube. Sometimes you go into a hospital situation, a clinic, or a home, a nursing home, and you see an indication NPO. NPO means nothing per oral, means that the patient cannot swallow anything. And the patient cannot tolerate a tube either through their throat. Okay, NPO, you see that sign, NPO, quite a bit. And therefore, tubes will not do. And so the patient needs to go to parenteral nutrition, parenteral, all right? In other words, they need to bypass the throat and maybe the GI tract also altogether. So this will require a line to the veins, which is the return circulation to the heart. Remember, arteries pump blood out of the heart, arteries go out of the heart, and veins come back into the heart, all right? And so this is going to require an intravenous IV, puncture and port to be maintained, and then subject to infection, so it's delicate. There are two types of parenteral nutrition depending on how much nutrition is actually being supplied, whether it's partial or total. A normal UV, a standard UV for hydrating someone, for example, when a person is dehydrated, all right? You see the UV and typically a clear bag on the tree, on the Christmas tree. It will be dextrose, some kind of sugar and minerals to hydrate the person, mostly water. And sometimes an antibiotic also is a smaller bag. And that would be partial parenteral nutrition. But if the patient needs total parenteral nutrition, in other words, total nutrition, which can be done, then that's called TPN. And then that requires a central line to a main vein because it is more concentrated and there's a larger volume also to be pumped into the body. So these are the lines that are established, typically on the neck, right? The veins that are returning to the heart from the neck region, or veins coming from the arms. And these are major lines of entry. So you'll see a patient that has a line on the side of the chest here underneath the clavicle. And again, these are veins, that's why they're shown in blue, returning, this is returning circulation to the heart. Why is it important? Why do they don't access through arteries? Arteries are flexible. Why are arteries flexible? Because they need to take the pressure, the pumping pressure of the heart. Okay, the diastole and systole, so 120 pounds per square inch. And therefore, arterial blood is moving away from the heart out to the body, to every part of the body. And so there's that pumping action, and if you put a needle into an artery, then that blood is trying to go up into the needle, okay, and into the syringe. So, whereas in the vein is returning circulation to the heart and it's more passive and there's no pumping action as such. So, by the way, how do veins move the blood back to the heart, especially from the heart down? You know, anything that is the lower parts of the body, from the heart down, how do that blood come back to the heart? Because it's going against gravity, literally, right? Let's say from my toe, the venous blood from my toe, which is carrying the toxin, is carrying CO2 to get rid of up in the heart, up in the lungs. It's got to come all the way from the toe through the heart to the lungs. Well, it's done by a series of little valves that are inside, these little valves, they're one-way valves that are inside the veins, okay? And those are the things that pop out when you put your arm down. If your veins are fairly close out, you see little bumps. The little bumps that you see on your arm, those are the valves inside the veins. That they're one-way valves, just like the heart valves, but much smaller. And so the circulation, the venous circulation, venous blood is being pushed back toward the heart, one valve at a time, okay? And they could be an average of an inch apart from each other, or half an inch. And we have all these little valves, and so they keep the blood moving slowly upward. And what actually pushes the blood up is the movement of the muscles, mostly the skeletal muscles. So when we move our muscles, that is secondarily squeezing on veins, and the blood that is there can only go one way because of those little valves that prevent movement backwards. Okay, maybe I should. The picture says 1,000 words, right? So I could just show a picture of this instead of trying to describe it. Let's see. I don't know if it's going to show me what I, oh, here maybe. No, those are varicose. Let me see.
I don't think that is right now.
Let's see. Okay, so there we go. See, the valves are one-way valves. So when there's a normal, yeah, in varicose, the valves are defective, they give. And so there's return circulation, which is not supposed to be, and it accumulates until it catches a valve that is good, and that makes the vein pop or the vein swell. All right, some valves are defective. But this is normal. You see, these are one-way valves. When muscles around the vein squeeze, then that blood is pushed one way in the only direction it can go. When the muscle relaxes and the vein opens up a little bit, if you will, the blood tries to flow back, but the valve closes in on it and catches. And this is, we have, I don't know how many hundreds or maybe thousands of these valves throughout our whole circulatory system, all on the return blood and the venous blood. Interesting. So anyway, that's why veins are used, because they naturally will move the nutrition toward the heart, and the heart will then pump it out through arteries to the rest of the body. So really the heart is doing the work of the pumping. So these are different entry lines, the ones that we have along the groin, on the arm, underneath the neck, underneath the clavicles, and the neck are the main ports. These entries have to be kept clean, all right, and they have to be changed periodically. Okay, so total parenteral nutrition should not be, is considered temporary, all right, it's considered temporary because the substance is very concentrated, and it has typically carbohydrates, it has amino acids, it has minerals, and of course, a lot of water itself to hydrate. So it provides both nutrition and hydration simultaneously. On peripheral veins, because of the concentration, it can clog them up. So that's why it needs a central line, a central venous line for a main vein, preferably going directly to the heart. And we have about 4 or 5 of those in the body, bilaterally. All right, so TPN is not to be used when a patient has an intact GI tract, okay? If the gastrointestinal system is working, then these parenteral nutrition is temporary. It should switch over to the gastric tube, to the NG tube, or to the PEG. And the main reason is that it can cause more complications. It does not preserve the GI tract. What does it mean to preserve the GI tract? Is that the stomach and the intestines need food to be going through it, especially fiber, for cleansing it, for cleaning it, all right, and for maintaining the peristaltic motion. Peristaltic motion. Let me put it here. See. Peristalsis is the one-way motion through the stomach and through the intestines, in fact, even the esophagus, of moving food down. All right, it's a wave-like motion. It's as if you had a marble inside a hose and you're squeezing the hose next to the marble and you're pushing the marble down that way. Okay, that's peristalsis. Remember that the GI tract, it's a smooth muscle. It's involuntary but coordinated precisely through the brainstem to push food down, and that's peristalsis. And so when there is a blockage or when there is a paralysis of that peristalsis, it's a problem because the person can become impacted. Impacted meaning holding food inside, especially down in the colon area or the large intestine for several days, 2, 3, 4 days, very dangerous, okay? And so to have a good movement, one should really have a bowel movement every day. That's the ideal. And to do that, lots of water. And if one has difficulty, might as well put it in here since it kind of fits. For people who have difficulty with the bowel movement, you know, they tend to be constipated, is a glass of warm water, hot water, as hot as you can tolerate it, early in the morning as soon as you wake up, before you eat or drink anything else. A tall glass of hot water, because it stimulates the GI tract into peristalsis, okay? It stimulates the GI tract. Remember, inside we're 98.6 degrees, okay? So it's pretty warm inside. And so a glass of hot water is very healthy for the body, first thing early in the morning. And we heard this from, I was with some relatives, my brother and sister-in-law and I were visiting in Guatemala. We went to see some ruins there. And anyway, we were in a town called Antigua, Guatemala. Was the first capital of Central America back in colonial times. It's a very pretty town. At any rate, it was a pharmacist who told us that remedy there in Antigua, Guatemala, all right? And for those people who have issues with constipation, it works like a charm. I highly recommend it. And it's totally, so far, for free. Okay, so total parenteral nutrition should only be temporary, all right? If the patient is in a vegetative state, actually the best thing would be the PEG. Now, let's look a bit more in detail at the bioethical analysis of nutrition and hydration, because in principle, it is an ordinary means of life support. Okay? In principle, they are ordinary means of life support. So this word in principle is saying that there are exceptions. And exceptions basically come down to two. And one is more physiological, the other one is more psychological. And the two exceptions are, first, if that nutrition and or hydration is no longer being absorbed or assimilated by the body. Okay. What does that mean? Well, absorbed mean by the intestines. All right, that the intestines are shutting down and that the nutrition is, or the hydration is no longer being absorbed by the intestines. Typically, the small intestine, which is longer but narrower, So the reference, small and large, you know, is not the length, but it's the diameter of the intestines, right? Let me go back here for a moment. No. Yes, okay. So the small intestine is called small because of a small diameter, but it's actually longer. It's about 20 feet, all right? It's longer than the large intestine, which is almost like a U shape or like a rectangle, okay, shape. The large intestine is larger in diameter, but shorter in length. So in the small intestine absorbs mostly the nutrition. And the large intestine, the last thing that is left on the bolus, on the food that is moving through, is to absorb the water, hydration. So a large intestine absorbs mostly water. Okay, so the exceptions are when the nutrition and or hydration are no longer being absorbed, that's at the level of the intestines, or assimilated, that's at the level of the tissues, or the organs or tissues are no longer assimilating that food or that hydration or that water, okay? Basically, vital organs that are shutting down. So this is very much a physiological event. And so at this point, medically, nutrition and hydration are contraindicated. They're contraindicated because they are actually doing more harm to the patient. I've actually been in hospitals to anoint a patient who is dying, and the patient is bloated. They're like a balloon, okay? They're bloating and they're actually oozing out fluid through their skin. You know, at that point, there's been some kind of oversight because that patient is getting too much hydration, okay? And the kidneys, it could be a matter, it can start and develop within minutes, okay? So maybe the nurse just hasn't picked it up. Maybe the nurse hasn't checked on this patient for half an hour or an hour or a couple of hours, and it could lead to that situation, because then definitely the kidneys are shutting down. There's no more output, there's no more urine, all right? And all the water is being retained, all the nutrition, the hydration, and it just starts oozing out through the body. It's excessive. Definitely that patient is being overhydrated and is contraindicated. And the patient is dying, there's renal failure, so the patient is dying. The other one is in the estimation of the patient. This particular procedure is an excessive burden. Now you can see that this is very subjective, but it is maintained by the ERDs, the ethical and religious directives of Catholic healthcare services. So this one at first may seem too benign or too subjective, you know, it could lead to potentially suicide, but let's consider it a little closer. I want to make reference to this one page that I gave you. It's part of the ethical and religious directives for Catholic healthcare services, all right? Now, this document, which is a little brochure, I'm going to get them for you. I just have been late in getting them, but it's a little brochure, and it's very handy. It has essentially all the bioethical issues in healthcare from the Catholic perspective, all right, for determining what is appropriate and what is not appropriate. And is actually subdivided into 6 parts. One of the parts is the doctor-patient relationship. The other part is bioethical issues at the beginning of life. This one is bioethical issues at the end of life. There's also a part on the spiritual aspect of healthcare, the social aspect of healthcare, and the final part is on cooperation. This is at the institutional level, so it'll be cooperation between a Catholic facility and a non-Catholic facility. You can also download it for free from the internet from the bishop's website. Okay. And, but I'll get it for you in booklet form. It costs about $2 if I order it, and then I'll just pass on the cost to you guys. But this is the document here, okay? And I just printed here part 5, which is bioethical issues at the end of life, the dying patient. Here are all the 6 parts I was talking about. So you can see here, and each part has the same form. It has an introduction, which is narrative form, and then it has directives, which are numbered sequentially from 1 to 70 something, okay? And so these are directives 55 through 66, as you can see. These are all bioethical issues toward the end of life. Look, for example, at 56 and 57. 56. A person has a moral obligation to use ordinary or proportionate means of preserving his or her life. Proportionate means are those that, in the judgment of the patient, offer a reasonable hope of benefit and do not entail an excessive burden or impose excessive expense on the family or the community. Okay, that's ordinary means. Let me bring it up so that people online can see it also. Give me a minute. Here it is. But look at 57. Okay. Can you see it, or should I make it smaller? No, kidding. Bigger. Okay. A person may forego extraordinary or disproportionate means of preserving life. Disproportionate means, it goes to define it, are those that in the patient's judgment do not offer a reasonable hope of benefit or entail an excessive burden or impose excessive expense on the family or the community. So that's pretty broad, right? You can basically drive a truck through that loophole, like they say. Now, this is because the patient's wishes are to be respected as much as possible, as long as they don't contradict Catholic teaching, okay? So the key word here is reasonable. In other words, it's assuming that the patient is thinking reasonably. When the patient is irrational, what can we do? We need to try to convince the patient. But at the end of the day, if we cannot convince the patient has rights, all right? And for example, if a Jehovah's Witness has a right to refuse a transfusion, which can save their life because of religious beliefs, the medical profession has to stand by. They cannot strap the person down and give them a transfusion against their will, right? And so that's where the pastoral team is extremely important, to come in and try to convince the patient, look, this is good for you, this is temporary, you have a good prognosis. But if the prognosis is very poor, then the patient may forego those extraordinary means, and then what kicks in is just care, all right?
You know, Father,
palliative care.
you see a lot of these cases with the Jehovah's Witness. Every now and again, you'll see an article appear.
Yes.
Concerning the parents and how they're in the hospitals with their children.
Yes.
So,
what to do?
That's a tough call.
It is very tough, but what is the alternative? Are we going to strap the person down and put an IV against their will? That's exposure, right? That's legal, that's illegal, and it's immoral. We have to convince the patient, we have to try to convince the patient, but if we cannot convince the patient, we got to pray and let it go, because if they're still rational now, if they're unconscious, Then the proxy kicks in, and hopefully the proxy is a reasonable person. That's why it has here, or the family or the community. Okay. But I want to give you a little more background about these ERDs, because these ERDs, as we call them, ethical and religious directives, right, for Catholic healthcare purposes, I told you they come from, this is the site of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, USCCB, all right? USCCB is the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. This is on the 5th edition already. This is from 2009. And by the way, it needs some updating on some new issues that weren't around 9 years ago. But this document has gone to Rome, to the Vatican, has been reviewed by the Vatican and approved and sent back with it's okay. So this is the official standard teaching of the Catholic Church today. Okay. And so I think it needs a little bit of analysis for us to understand where is the primacy of the conscience of the individual.
Father, how does it stand? Does the Catholic Church universally accept this, or
okay,
variance in the churches in Europe?
Right. So this is the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. All right. There are some equivalent documents in other Catholic conferences throughout the world. Great Britain typically has one. Some other countries in Europe, maybe Italy. To be honest, I haven't checked, what other countries have it, but I suspect that many other Catholic conferences have similar documents, but they may be tailored more to their particular situation. Sure. Okay. For example, this one on part 4 of the beginning of life issues, it has practically half of it, or 2/3 of it, is devoted to in vitro fertilization. Well, that may not be an issue in other parts of the world, not as strongly, but here it's big, and in Europe it's also big, okay? But more directly to your question, yes, this is the universal teaching of the Catholic Church, and this can be applied and should be applied. In fact, all Catholic hospitals and healthcare facilities, not just the hospitals, but nursing homes and rehab centers that are Catholic in the United States, they are supposed to abide by the ERDs. Okay, these ERDs are binding to Catholic healthcare services in the United States. And we represent about, I think it's about 10 to 15% of all the healthcare in the United States is Catholic healthcare. All right, so it's significant. But these are the ERDs. This is a standing document. It gets revised periodically, like you say. Like you see, this is the 5th edition already, right? But it's already 8 years old, and there are a number of issues here. For example, there's nothing about transgenderism. There has been questions of should Catholic hospitals be involved in sex changes, which the intuition is no. But what is the ethical analysis for saying no? Okay, it has to be grounded in natural law and in Catholic teaching and so forth. So, but this is the current document, this 5th edition, which, like I said, is from 2009, and there it is in black and white. So a lot that the patient has a duty, first of all, to form their conscience, and then to act according to their conscience. That's why I keep bringing up the one that is most familiar to me existentially is renal failure and dialysis. At some point, after years, and not qualifying, some patients just don't qualify for transplant, or they're very low on the list, 90,000, 100,000, they don't have a chance. And after years, they just get tired of it and they say, enough is enough. It's still standard practice is the dialysis, but they have decided, because of this second part, that it has become an excessive burden. So it's something to consider and to reflect upon. Okay. All right, well, at this point, we can stop. for a little while for the break. Again, in principle, nutrition and hydration are ordinary means of life support. At some point, we may have to make a distinction between nutrition and hydration, depending on what is more urgent for the patient, because hydration is more urgent, but in the long run, nutrition also has to be supplied, all right? But the person could be dehydrated but not malnourished. That happens quite often with the elderly. All right, they just don't drink enough water because, let's say, they're incontinent, and that means they have to go to the bathroom all the time, or they have to be using Pampers and changing their Pampers, so they don't want to drink water. And it's very difficult to convince them to drink water, and they are dehydrating and they're damaging their kidneys little by little. Okay, so we can stop for a while, a little bit, and then come back and we'll look at the case of Terri Schiavo. Okay. Before we break, any questions or comments?
I'll ask you during the break, Father.
Okay, very good. So let's take a break now. I'm going to pause recording, come back in about 15, 20 minutes, okay? Thank you. Okay, welcome back, everyone. We're going to go into the second part of these bioethical issues at the end of life, specifically nutrition and hydration today. Just want to make sure it's recording. I'm neurotic about recording. The other day I was giving a presentation for several hours and I forgot to record. I had everything else going on and I forgot to record it. So, well, the presentation went on, but I didn't have a way of saving it. At any rate, we're going to look at the case of Terri Schiavo, okay, who was born in 1963 and died in 2005 at age 41. This case is very dramatic for us here in Florida because it happened in Florida, but it escalated all the way up to the federal government, including Congress and the Supreme Court of the United States, and it also went to Rome. It influenced Pope John Paul II at one point in a statement that he made on nutrition and hydration with regards to persistent vegetative state, which was what happened to Terri. I also want to point out, just for the record, that people know her as Terri Schiavo. Well, this is a married name, right? Schiavo or Schiavo, whatever you want to pronounce it, but this is actually an Italian word, and it's really pronounced Schiavo. It's pronounced Schiavo, right? Because the H here is mute. It makes the C a hard sound, like a K. So this is pronounced Schiavo in Italian, and Schiavo means slave. All right, that's what it means. This is the last name of Michael, the husband. Her last name, maiden name, was Schindler. Schindler from her parents, okay?
Schindler?
Schindler, yeah.
Like
Schindler's List? Like Schindler's List, yes. Two ironies on all this, but these are the names. That's why Shakespeare said, what's in a name, right?
Yeah.
So Schindler by maiden name and Schiavo by married name. But we'll pronounce it the American way, Schiavo, Terri Schiavo. Oh, actually, what happened here? Oh no, sorry. Yeah. So this is a timeline that I developed according to the events. It's a little long, and we might skip a few because the bar is all the way up here, okay? But she was born in 1963, Teresa Schindler, in Pennsylvania. and she will jump to her marriage at 20 years of age to Michael Schiavo, who was about a year older than her. All right, they married in the Catholic Church, and a few years later, they moved to St. Petersburg because Terri's parents had retired at St. Petersburg, so they moved with them. So at first it was the four of them. Now, in 1990, she collapses in the middle of the night. And it was just Terri and her husband, Terri and Michael. They weren't living in the same house. I don't think so. They were living on their own, but her parents were living nearby. This is all in St. Petersburg, Florida. She collapses, and according to the report, Michael finds her several hours later. She collapses in the middle of the night, and it's a big unknown there why she was actually several hours on the floor. Michael claims that he didn't know that she had collapsed. Maybe she got up in the middle of the night, maybe to go to the kitchen to get some food or something, but she collapses. And when she collapses, seemingly she had a heart attack, and she may have been low in potassium. And then the consequence of that is that she went into hypoxia, or low oxygen to the brain. So she had partial brain death. Okay. Now, she was rushed to the hospital. When Michael found her, he called 911, and the ambulance came. They rushed her to a hospital, and they inserted a PEG. She was 26-year-old when that happened. She was discharged from the hospital, went to a rehab center, and the court appointed Michael as the guardian because Terri had no documents, no living wills, or no advance directives or anything like this. There was a conversation that Michael claimed that they had about end-of-life issues, and I'll get to that when it comes appropriate a little further down. All right. The parents didn't object. Her parents did not object to Michael being the guardian at first. They were in good terms with the in-laws, okay? Michael and his in-laws,
It wouldn't have any legal, it wouldn't have a legal stand, your father, because...
Correct. But at first, they were in good relations with each other, all right? At least as far as is known. This was very sudden. What happened, it was not, it took everybody by surprise. But the medical profession did what they had to do. They tried to resuscitate her. Didn't happen, so they put a PEG, and she is, at least for now, in a coma. And so someone has to take care of her legally and do all the legal proceedings and signing and everything else, release forms, whatever. So Michael is assigned the legal guardianship. Then she's transferred to another hospital for rehab. The rehab is not very successful. Eventually, they bring her home, or to the Schindler's home, to her parents, okay? But a few weeks later, they have to put her back into a rehab center because the parents are overwhelmed with Terri's care, at least initially, all right? So at some point, Michael takes her that same year, toward the end of the year, Michael takes her to California for some kind of an experimental treatment. See, there's no standard protocol for her. She's not waking up from the coma, but there is an experimental treatment in California for stimulating the brain. And he takes her there. And there's even a transplant inserted into her brain. Doesn't work. So they come back to Florida. Michael and Terri come back to Florida. All this time, Terri is in this state of coma, right? She's put into another rehab center in Brandon, and she's on 24-hour skilled care. Eventually, she's transferred to another facility, and some more testing goes on. Try to do some occupational therapy, some speech therapy. Let's continue. She's unresponsive to all these treatments. Okay. At this point, the Schindlers separate from Michael and Terri physically. They move to two different households. And of course, Terri continues then with Michael, under the care and supervision of Michael. There's a lawsuit, there's a malpractice suit, and the settlement, Michael gets $250,000 from that first settlement. And then later from another lawsuit, another medical malpractice, there is a $1 million award. Michael gets about $300,000, and then $750,000 go into a trust fund for the care of Terri. Okay, so now there's starting to be big money associated with this case, with her treatment or unresponsiveness, and lawsuits are going on, malpractice. There's a further separation between Michael and the Schindlers. The Schindlers want to take care of their daughter, but Michael claims that he's in charge 100%, which he had the court back him up on that. So then the Schindlers begin legal proceedings to try to remove Michael as the guardian, right? And that suit is dismissed. There's no merit. Then the court assigns a guardian ad litem because there's controversy here. So there is a guardian to look into the case and makes a report. And whether Michael was acting appropriately toward his wife or not, was given proper care, was given the proper guardianship, right? And the report says that yes, Michael was given the proper guardianship, that there was no abuse going on in the guardianship. So bottom line is that Michael basically has the legal care of Terri. Terri continues with the PEG, and now Terri makes the claim, Michael makes the claim that Terri would not like to live this way, all right? At this point, she is in PVS, she's in a vegetative state, and what Michael claims is that since there are no documents, that in one conversation at some point, Terri had mentioned that if somehow it came up in the conversation, maybe a relative or a friend or someone, or maybe they saw it on the news, something about vegetative state or something intubated. And Michael said that Terri commented, while she was still lucid and healthy and everything else, that she would never want to live that way, referring to vegetative state. She would never want to live that way. That would be her wishes, her opinion. So that's what Michael claimed. But again, there's nothing signed, no documents. So because he's the official guardian, he's the legal guardian, the court has to go, the legal system has to go on his word. And it is his word against her parents' word. The parents want to take care of her with the PEG, but Michael says, no, she doesn't want to live this way, okay? So there is a petition to take out the PEG, Now, all this time, she is in a vegetative state. She's not actively dying. In other words, She is in bed or sitting up, unresponsive, a tube to her stomach, but she's breathing on her own, and the heart is beating on its own also. So she's not intubated she's not on a vent, all right? So you see the clinical situation. Sometimes she tracks. Tracking is with the vision. If someone comes into the room, especially if someone, well, I don't want to say especially if someone that she knows, but tracking is that sometimes a PVS patient will be totally unresponsive, but if a person walks in front of them, they may track with the eyes the person or the body that is moving in front of them, okay? Not the head, but just the eyes. They can, it's called tracking. It's typically, it's a horizontal motion. Whether it's voluntary or unconscious, autonomic, is not known, okay? Because you cannot get into the brain of a PVS patient. What are they thinking? Are they thinking? Mm-hmm. So it's known, it's documented that she could track sometimes, but it's not known if that was voluntary or not. All right, the judge gets involved. This Judge Greer, which is first name is, I thought it was Judge, okay. So Judge Greer gets involved, and eventually it is Judge Greer who will have to make the decision to disconnect the peg or not, all right? But Judge Greer essentially rules in favor of Michael's request to disconnect the peg, and it's going to happen in 1 to 2 weeks. The Schindlers file a petition to allow a swallow test. Essentially, this was kind of a legal move to look for time. Everybody pretty much knew that she couldn't swallow on her own, that she would be unresponsive, but this was a way to buy some time legally. Mm-hmm. The judge denies the petition for the swallow test. Also, Michael wants to restrict the Schindlers from visiting Terri, the parents from visiting Terri. All right. And so he gets that granted by the judge. So it's getting more and more acrimonious, more and more antagonistic, and very extremely legal. There is a petition that escalates to above Judge Greer to the Second District Court of Appeals. Okay, that district court upholds Judge Greer's ruling. So basically everything is in favor of Michael. Well, he's got the legal document, right? Which is what? What is the legal document here? The marriage license. Yeah. It's a marriage license from Pennsylvania, because they married in Pennsylvania. Not the church marriage, but the civil marriage in Pennsylvania, which is valid across the US. All right. The litigation continues back and forth. At some point, the peg is going to be removed April 1st. The Schindlers then petition for the judge to be removed, not the peg, but the judge. Okay. That removing the judge is denied, and it escalates up to the Supreme Court of Florida. The Florida Supreme Court now decides not to review the case. And so it goes back to the Second Court of Appeal. Case numbers is extremely legal. There's a federal judge that comes in, that is this George Lazara, okay? And he rules in favor of the Schindlers. This is at the federal level. Okay, so now it's gone out of the state. And this judge rules in favor of the Schindlers, Terri's parents, for a stay in order to exhaust all their legal appeals, all the legal possibilities. Back and forth again, Justice Anthony Kennedy of the judge, now is one of the 9 Supreme Court justices. You may remember Judge Anthony Kennedy is the one who broke the tie on homosexual marriage in favor of legalizing it. And Anthony Kennedy is a Catholic.
I think he was appointed by Reagan.
Was it Reagan?
Yeah, I think
okay.
He was supposed to be.
Yeah, he's been there a long time.
Conservative, but
yeah,
when he got there, something happened.
Yeah, I don't know what it is. The water must be the water in DC or something. But yeah, I tell you, I've heard recently. This was my personal opinion as private citizen Alfred Chaffee, that he is talking about retirement. Yeah. Thanks be to God, because it can never be too late. It can never be too soon. I'm sorry. Anyway, that's where it's at. He gets involved, and he refuses the stay of the district court of George Lazara. All right, but the important thing is that now the Supreme Court is, at least one judge in the Supreme Court is engaged. So bottom line, in 2001, the peg is removed. Peg number 1, because eventually the peg is reinserted, okay? So the peg is removed, which means that now Terri is actively dying because she's getting no nutrition, no hydration. All right? So she's beginning to die slowly of malnutrition and dehydration in April of 2001. A new judge comes into the case. Here's the long and the short of it. This is Sirico, so it goes back to Florida. And this Judge Quesada now orders the peg to be reinstated, again, to give the Schindlers a possibility of exhausting all their legal appeals.
Well, can he go against the Supreme Court?
Well, because the Supreme Court did not refuse to hear the case. It was just an individual ruling of
Kennedy.
Judge Kennedy.
Oh, so the Supreme Court didn't hear the case.
Correct. Oh. And exactly. But Judge Kennedy, what Judge Kennedy did was he said that that federal judge, it was a district. So at the state level, there is district and there's Supreme Court at the state level. Okay, there's district, there's county, district, Supreme Court. There's county judges for Dade County. Then there's a region, which is called district. And then there's Supreme Court. As far as I know, there's 3 layers. At the federal level, I think essentially there's 2 layers. There's district, federal, and then there is Supreme Court for the whole nation. And that's the ultimate court of appeal, all right? But so a higher court can accept to hear a case or deny it. If it denies to hear a case, it goes back down to the next level below, okay? And that's what Kennedy said that that federal district court, Lazara, who had put a stay on removing the peg. Okay. What happens with many of these cases, in legal cases, there's a lot of negatives, and it's one negative after another, you know, so a double negative then makes a thing positive. So what Judge Kennedy said was that what George Lazara had done to put a stay on removing the peg was not legal, and that it had to go back, essentially back to the states. It had to go back to the state of Florida, okay? So the first peg is removed. 3 days later, the peg is reinstated because of another judge, Judge Quesada, in Florida, right? And so the peg is reinstated 3 days later.
Wow.
Michael appeals that, and it goes up to the second DCA court, which again, the same ruling, they affirmed their previous ruling to remove the peg, all right? the case is sent back to Judge Greer, and Greer agrees to remove the peg at a particular time. In the meantime, July goes by. Now it's in August. The Schindlers make another motion to have their own doctor examine their daughter, a different doctor, okay, to see if Terri, in fact, is being cared for properly or not, and if the peg could stay. There's another date for removing the peg here of August 29, and there is another motion to stay that removal, in other words, to not remove the peg until October. Because of the legal mess, all right, there is a stay to leave the peg indefinitely, the second one. Michael, of course, is going to appeal that, and he keeps going back and forth. There's another, the 5 doctors examine her. That report comes in. They all agree that she is in PVS, in vegetative state. There is an appeal to the Supreme Court of Florida for the Supreme Court to essentially affirm Judge Greer's decision to remove the peg and to have Terri die from malnutrition and dehydration. So, you know, we don't, in principle, nutrition and hydration obligate, right? Okay, let me go further down. There's further action back and forth. At some point, it becomes evident, it is known that Michael is having an affair, but he's still the husband, the legal husband of Terri. At this point, it's an open affair. It's known in the media, and he has a child with this other woman, but he doesn't divorce Terri.
That was in 1990. I think it was as early as that.
Yes, yeah, the affair, it turns out that the affair it's not really known exactly when the affair started, if it started even before Terri's collapse. But there's money involved because, remember, there's that $750,000 in an account, in a fund for Terri's care. If she dies, then if they're still married, Michael will inherit that. So there's a lot of suspicion on the intentions of Michael.
But that $750,000, wasn't it supposed to take care of Terri?
Yes.
And so none of that money was used in all of his care?
I don't know, is a short answer. But what I do know and remember from the case is that there was money available. Maybe there was another insurance.
Yeah, I know that there was another $1 million insurance.
There was money available. Yeah. If Terri died, then Michael would inherit. Maybe that was a life insurance or something like that. It was a different type.
I think it'll show up here.
Yeah, but there was money in the background if Terri died. So there was, let's say that there was a fiscal incentive for killing Terri because of the insurance that was there.
And the reason why I think, anyway, we show the $750,000 had been burnt out. But like 2 days after she dies, he collects like $1 million in insurance, which was not disclosed before. Something like that.
There was I think it was a life insurance. Okay, so there's a lot of legal action going back and forth. At some point, the governor gets involved, which was back then Governor Bush, right? And he carves out a law. He asked the state legislature to put a law, to craft a law that is known as Terry's Law, that is so crafted that is very, very particular to this case. It's a very rare thing because law is not supposed to be so specific. Okay, you legislate for the norm for the general public. But this was a very specific law that it was a one-time stay in certain cases, which that certain cases was the case of Terri Schiavo. All right, the stay meaning not to remove the peg. That's when that the peg would stay. In other words, you can see it that way. It is a stay from the order to remove the peg, which was the original order granted by Judge Greer to Michael on the claims that Terry would not like to live this way. Okay, so this stay is a legal technical term, and you know what it means. It's to hold everything, to not remove the peg. But the second peg had been removed. Afterwards, Governor Bush gets this law through, and so the second peg is reinstated. Okay. So now we're in October 2003. She has now a third peg reinstated. There was one of these times she was off the peg like maybe 1 or 2 weeks or something like that. So she was actively dying of malnutrition and dehydration, okay, while all this was going on in the background. Jeb Bush gets his brother involved. George was the president at that time. W was the president, and of course W is in favor of what his brother is doing here in Florida, so it has big political implications. Okay, but this Michael claims that this Terry's Law is unconstitutional, and the ACLU gets involved, of course. So there's another doctor appointed to study Terry's case. And this doctor is affirms both the legal and the medical opinions of regarding Terry. This is all legal action that is occurring in the court because of the recourses that seemingly are still left to the Schindlers. And it has to do with the constitutionality of Terry's Law. At this point, Pope John Paul II addresses the World Federation of Catholic Medical Associations at the Pontifical Academy for Life Congress on life sustainment treatment and the vegetative state. Scientific advances and ethical dilemmas was the theme of that Congress. This is happening at the Vatican. The Pope weighs in, and of course, then that gets disseminated worldwide, and it actually had a little tweak on directive, on the introduction. Look at the introduction of the ERDs, the last paragraph. I will show you. The last paragraph, after it mentions the individual bishops and state Catholic conferences, second paragraph, the third paragraph there. These statements agree, in the middle of the last paragraph, these statements agree that hydration and nutrition are not morally obligatory either when they bring no comfort to a person who is imminently dying. Terri was not imminently dying, right? She was in a vegetative state, but she was clinically stable. Or when they cannot be assimilated by the person's body, which she could still assimilate. The USCCB Committee on Pro-Life Activities report, in addition, points out the necessary distinctions between questions already resolved by the magisterium. That little phrase, questions already resolved by the magisterium, is a direct reference to the Pope when he made the statement about vegetative state. And essentially the statement of the Pope on this, on John Paul II, was that nutrition and hydration in principle are ordinary means, even if they have to be medically supplied, all right? So the fact that is artificial does not make it necessarily extraordinary. This is a direct reference to the PEG itself. The PEG is artificial because what's natural nutrition and hydration? Chewing the food and swallowing it. Chewing and swallowing is the natural. Anything out of that is unnatural, okay? So the PEG is artificial, granted. But the fact that it's artificial doesn't mean necessarily that it is extraordinary. It's a non sequitur, okay? We have to evaluate it in its own case. It could be artificial, but ordinary. What kicks in? The two exceptions. Either the body's no longer assimilating the food or the water, or the patient says, this is enough, I don't want it anymore. Or if the patient is unconscious, essentially Terri's case, then the proxy, the next of kin, the guardian, whoever was assigned, either by the patient before or by the court if the patient never assigned anyone. Okay, so you see, I'm trying to make an emphasis for the importance of the documents, for all of us to have a living will, a Catholic living will, all right, and a proxy, and to have certain document that states our wishes. If we ever go into PBS, God forbid, what do we want done? Do we want to be maintained indefinitely with a PEG, for example, or not allowed to die? Because we have the option. All right. So moving forward. Let me cut to the chase here. All the legal action that keeps going back and forth, including the Florida Supreme Court, Governor Bush, of course. And it is not listed here on this official stuff, but what's going on in the church. Because Terri was within a diocese, was in the Diocese of Tampa, St. Petersburg. He was Bishop. Sorry? No, it was not Bishop Richard. It was not John Nevins either. Anyway, it escapes right now. It will come to me, but he's the current bishop. At any rate, here the Supreme Court refuses to hear the case, so it goes back to the state, Florida. But in the Catholic Church, there's a lot of controversy. There are demonstrations going on over there. They have to do a perimeter of safety. At one point, the marshal came in and the police officers to cordon out the nursing home where she was, so the rehab center, because people were trying to get in and pray with Terri, over Terri, and there was people had to be kept out. Okay, but eventually that third peg is removed. It's the bottom line here. A lot of legal action back and forth. Let me get to that point. Yeah, the third peg is removed in 2005.
March 18th.
And this is the last peg that is removed. She's not intubated anymore. March 18, and she still lasted. So she starts actively dehydrating there. There is a debate in Congress about this issue. President Bush gets involved in that. March 18. Continue back and forth with the legal proceedings.
It says Dr. Cheshire says she's not in a persistent vegetative state. 309
Yes.
Paul.
Right. I'm sorry, what line are you at?
309.
309.
Yeah, see that?
Yes, exactly. That was one of the controversies, that some doctors declared that she was not in vegetative state, that she could have been locked-in syndrome, which means that her brain was indeed active but could not interact. All right. So there was that medical clinical controversy. Other doctors came in and solved that controversy. DCF gets involved also to have custody. I tell you, it's just a total legal morass back and forth what is happening here. More and more, the more people get involved, the more complicated it gets. But in the meantime, now she's off the third peg, so she's actively dying, all right? Just gonna get March 35. So from the 18th to the 31st, it's about a little over 2 weeks.
13 days.
No more. 18. Was it 18? 18.
13.
Yeah. Yeah. It's about 2 weeks. Yeah. It took 2 weeks for her without water. 2 weeks.
She died of hunger.
Yes.
And dehydration.
Yeah. Exactly. It's amazing that she actually lasted that long without water.
Well, in looking at her case file, could she be given something to, say, speed up the death process or
well,
I mean,
okay, exactly.
Because we don't know if she was feeling any pain, do we?
Exactly. So let's assume that Michael was in the right. In other words, that she had declared, indeed, that she didn't want to live that way. When he is trying to oblige by the wish, the fact that he was in an infidelity is aside. You know, it taints the whole thing. It puts him in a bad light, but it could still be that he did have her best interest in mind. All right. Why he didn't divorce her? He claims that he didn't divorce her because then he would lose custody over her, and her parents would take over, and her parents would continue to keep her alive indefinitely. Whether the motivation was totally like that, altruistic, or was fiscal to get the life insurance from Terri's death is anybody's guess. You know, we cannot pass judgment on his conscience. But infidelity aside, which could never be justified, if Michael had her best interest in mind, the peg could indeed be removed ethically, all right, because of that second exception, that is an excessive burden. She considered it an excessive burden. She just didn't want to live indefinite life. She's in her 20s. PVS patients continue to grow, okay? Yeah, because they're in a suspended animation, if you will. They're even more active than in suspended animation. Suspended animation, metabolism is essentially shut down, like frozen embryos. But in vegetative state, basic metabolism is occurring. And so if it's on a child, that child will continue to grow. Mm-hmm. It's just the brain, the cerebrum itself that is shut down, but the stem is active. And so you can think really indefinitely for how long, right? Because if there's really no hope of recovery, and the whole point was, did this brain, organically speaking, have any hope of recovery? What was the prognosis? Prognosis was very, very poor. There was no hope of recovery. Even that experimental treatment that was done in California did not work. In fact, finally, when the autopsy was done, this is the result of the autopsy, okay? Dr. Thogmartin released the results of the autopsy. It showed that Terri's condition was consistent with a person in vegetative state. This damage was irreversible. No amount of therapy or treatment would have regenerated the massive loss of neurons. Okay, and so we have to give the benefit of the doubt to the medical profession that that was a clinical determination that she really was brain dead, but she was partial brain dead. And therefore, she was not really dead. The stem, the brain stem was functioning, obviously, because she was breathing on her own and she was heart beating on her own, all right? And so it's a judgment call. If she really didn't want to live that way, and it's, again, it is kind of reasonable. If we are honest with ourselves, I wouldn't want to be living that way, you know, in a vegetative state indefinitely. To whose benefit, to whose purpose, right? I want to go to eternal life, so whatever is waiting for me.
Could this be determined for what before the autopsy that this damage was irreversible?
From every medical examination that was done on her, yes. Short of doing an autopsy while she was still on a peg because she was still living. You're not going to do autopsy on a living, right? Short of doing an autopsy on her brain, every medical exam that was done, the EEGs and all the other tests that were done, neurological tests, showed that the cerebrum was dead, that the cortex essentially had sustained extensive damage, all right? And there was no hope of recovery. Really, the prognosis clinically was extremely poor. All right. Now, you know, medicine is also very cautious, and they're not going to say it's a statistical science. So they're going to say, in cases like this, we have never seen a recovery, for example. But they're not going to say this one will never recover because they don't know.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a tough problem.
Yeah. And so, but all this because there really was no document. There was no document. I mean, why would there be, right, for a 20-year-old to sign a DNR or to sign a living will, right, or to be disconnected in a case of vegetative state? But now we have to consider it because these issues come up. And again, it got very complicated because the Schindlers wanted to hold on to their daughter. They always had a hope that she would recover, but that hope was not based on any clinical evidence. All right, it was just the hope of the instincts of the mother and the father of her. Michael, again, infidelity aside, may have indeed interpreted his wife correctly and her opinion, and was trying to defend that. But the infidelity makes it very messy, plus the insurance money also makes it messy. We have to cut through those things and see really what was the best interest for Terri. Okay? And the fact that he was prolonged this way, back and forth, 3 pegs connected and disconnected with all those consequences. So many people involved all the way up to the Supreme Court, all the way up to the Vatican. Mm-hmm. If there's any good that has come out of this, is a lot of clarification. So from the papal statement that came out on that Congress, then which one? I think it is, yes, 58. Directive 58 was tweaked so that it would show the current thinking of the church. So let's look at it's 58 specifically, the one that applies here. There should be a presumption in favor of providing nutrition and hydration to all patients, including patients who require medically assisted nutrition and hydration. That insert there, and I can tell you because I actually was part of the team that worked on this document several years ago with the National Catholic Bioethics Center, including patients who require medically assisted nutrition and hydration. that was inserted based on the papal statement of John Paul II that a medical act, even though it's an artificial act, is not necessarily an extraordinary act, morally speaking, ethically speaking. See the distinction? Something that is artificial is not necessarily extraordinary. Okay? It may be ordinary, it depends on the circumstances. And that's why that statement ends with, as long as this is of sufficient benefit to outweigh the burdens involved to the patient. So we're back to the benefit burden analysis. And I can tell you from experience that many times patients, just average laity, doesn't really know how to distinguish very well burden benefit. Okay, it gets very emotional, it gets very sentimental, and sometimes it's not too reasonable based on this benefit burden analysis. We as bioethicists can be a big help in helping people discern that. Because you know, the typical thing is that the family are going to be totally emotional about this and want to do, they're putting unrealistic expectations on the medical profession. The medical profession on their part, they're going to go legalistic. They're going to be afraid of a lawsuit, especially if it's an institution, what is called the deep pockets, right? And so they're going to try to oblige the family on doing unrealistic things. At the end of the day, who's hurting here? The patient, because then what happens is here a shift from extending the life of the patient to extending their death. All right? So a lot has to do with the diagnosis and a lot has to do with the prognosis and getting the family members to understand the meaning of that prognosis. Okay, so that's basically it on the case. I'll send you this PowerPoint, the spreadsheet. So if you want to review it in detail, it's up to you, but there's a lot of detail there, okay? I want to go back now to the last slide of the presentation. We see kind of two camps developing, the quality of life camp and the sanctity of life camp, okay? And it's sad that these camps see each other as mutually exclusive, because many people make an argument even from a secular perspective, from a utilitarian perspective. What's the quality of life of this patient? What was the quality of life of Terri in vegetative state? You know, arguably, from a human perspective, it was zero quality of life. It was a negative quality of life. She's in bed indefinitely with a tube to her stomach, and what's the purpose, right? Sanctity of life would argue, well, here we have a human being who is not dead, who is not dying actively, so we have to care. Nutrition and hydration, in principle, are ordinary means of life support, so we need to continue to feed and nourish and hydrate this person because she cannot do it on her own. Okay, so it would seem like these two are irreconcilable because one is looking at more the subjective value of that life. The other one is looking more at the objective value of a life, being a human life, being God's image, and therefore caring for those who cannot care for themselves. Okay. I don't think it has to be necessarily an either or. I think that we have to be realistic, and we can talk about the sacred quality. Where we do take into the consideration the physical, physiological state and even the mental state of the patient. Okay, we couldn't tell too much. We could tell much more about Terri's physical state than we could tell about her mental state. But we can assume what is reasonable. We can assume reasonably that her mental state was as poor as her physical state, okay, especially in vegetative state. So, given all that, we could assume that she did say those things to Michael when they were both young and happy and in their marriage and just giving an opinion about someone else that they had seen or heard about. And so we follow those wishes. And at least for my part, being totally honest with myself and with yourselves, if I were in that condition, I wouldn't want to be continued in that sense. Okay. So then palliative care kicks in. The peg is removed. So let's follow the scenario. What would you do in a case that it is ethical and moral and would follow Catholic teaching? Comfort care, right? Comfort care, which would be the other two, the shelter and the human contact, and also palliative care and analgesics, because at some point the patient may be feeling pain or suffering, and so an appropriate amount of morphine to try to, or some kind of pain relief in case the patient is feeling pain. All right, and the process will continue until the patient actually dies. But PVS is just about the toughest one because, like you can see, the patient can be kept indefinitely with a peg, and especially if they're breathing on their own and if they're relatively young. It's very, no one likes to pull that plug, literally, pull that tube. Okay. But if in the estimation of the patient, this is an excessive burden, and if the patient is unconscious, then the next of kin, the proxy or the guardian, can make that decision. It's a very difficult decision, but we always have to focus on the patient, not ourselves and our sentiments and our feelings, but the patient, what would he or she want? Mm-hmm. So bottom line, there's always a way out. There's always a way out when we consider that the patient's reasonable requests should be honored unless they go directly against some Catholic teaching. And so that takes care of suicide. If the request is unreasonable, then the institution can do a transfer of care. Go somewhere else, because here we're not going to give you the overdose. We're going to give you the right dose to manage the pain, but we're not going to give you the overdose. That flip of the coin, all right, the suicide, is going to be our next lecture, which is going to be on physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia. By coincidence, it's also another young lady, and she was in California, and her name was Brittany Maynard. You may have heard the case in California a few years ago. Brittany Maynard, she's the one who moved to Oregon to take the death pill. Anyway, I'll tell you about that case in detail next lecture when we look at physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia. Mm-hmm. Okay, questions, comments? A lot to think about here, right?
Yeah. Oh my,
a lot to think about.
On PVS, Father, he said this is the most complicated one it is, because really, I know no one who would like to live in the state that she was in.
Exactly.
And so removing the peg is, but she died of starvation and dehydration, right? Yes. Is there, I mean, not
she went down to skin and bones, so you can see some of the, at the end, she was not allowed to be photographed by court law, by court order, but even as she was thinning out, there were some photographs taken, and you can see them online.
But at this point, is there, I mean, was she going through any pain, or?
We don't know. We don't know, so she could have been given analgesics to take care of that. But it all, that could be treated, if you will, because there's a protocol for treating pain, all right? There's management, pain management, even if it's a morphine drip, whatever. But to me, the whole issue hinged, on Michael's word. Michael's word. Now, Michael's word was suspect because of two big issues: the infidelity, which was open and obvious, and the insurance. Okay, the big money. So that's why. But it could be that in spite of that, she did really say those, and we could assume that she did in a healthy conversation between the two of them, watching someone else. If Terri was watching herself, if we could do that somehow and have her watch herself, a few years prior, before all this had happened, she would probably say, no way I want to live that way. It makes sense, okay? Because there's no hope of recovery in her 20s.
In the timeline, it said it was caused by an imbalance of potassium.
Yes, that's the estimation. So much time had gone, years had gone by between her collapse and her death by the time they did the autopsy. So there was no trace of that. But the doctor there, the coroner, did mention that there was no sign, no evidence of abuse. It was also at some point, Michael was suspect of many things. Michael was suspect of violence, violence at home, and that he had actually hit her, and that's why she collapsed. And then why did she wait several hours? Why did he wait several hours before calling 911? I think it was also known that he knew CPR, and apparently he did not try to resuscitate her. Why? So there were a lot of questions that it all came out. All the dirty laundry was coming out in the trials. Okay, so there's a lot of stuff in the background, and it leaves a lot of questions. But at the end of the day, it's all because there was nothing written. There was just nothing written.
Father, I have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
So there was no further investigation into the beginning of the case, and by the parents that had some sort of suspicion about Michael?
Yes, so at this point, there's even an institution, a foundation or something, the Terri Schiavo Foundation, that is still going on. Her brother has taken on the cause, okay? I think it's Robert Schindler. Her brother has taken on the cause for the good, for PVS patients not to be disconnected without their will. And the whole pro-life, at one point the Schindlers went to the Vatican and actually saw the Pope and everything.
I just mean for criminal. Hello? I can't hear you. Hello? No.
On mute. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay,
yeah.
Sorry, I think I pressed the button.
Yeah.
I wanted to go to the beginning.
I was just wondering if there was any charges, there should have been charges against him, or any sort of investigation, because she was found there for so long, and you said that he knew CPR and he didn't do that, so there should have been.
Yeah, but all he claims is that he was asleep. He didn't really, until he woke up and walked out of the room, because she had collapsed in the hallway, I believe. Oh. It was outside of their room. He woke up at some point early in the morning or before dawn and walked out and saw her on the floor. That was his claim. But it was determined that she was indeed on the floor for several hours, and there was some suspicion that perhaps there was some wrongdoing going on. I was trying to see the dates here.
But there was no sign of abuse, though.
The collapse, there was no sign of abuse, but but I wanted to see. She collapsed in 1990. Okay, she collapsed in 1990, and she died. The autopsy was done in 2005.
Yeah, and they never well, I'm sure that they gave her physical when she went to the doctor.
Yes, back then, yes, obviously there was nothing in that initial report. So there is so 25 years had gone by, no? To 2005, 15 years. So yeah, good point. In the original report, when she was taken into emergency here, right? She's discharged from this hospital. Obviously, in that report at the hospital, was the hospital, Humana North Side, there was nothing that showed as physical abuse.
Right.
Now, one could question how thorough. I think that's probably a community hospital there.
Yeah.
Okay, Humana North South. How thorough was that done? Maybe they were focusing on getting her to a peg and so forth, and they didn't really look in detail for signs of abuse or violence. Okay, but certainly 15 years later, there's not going to be much left on the body itself if there was any abuse.
And how does the money go to Michael if he is, cheating on his wife and has a child?
Yeah, because, okay, so I think it's somewhere in here. I just have to dig through the narrative, but there was a life insurance issue, you see? So if Terri died, then that life insurance would go to Michael.
It's not on there though, Father.
It's not
Your
here.
life insurance is not on this.
No,
No, it's not on the standby.
it's not here. Yeah. Okay, so if on a life insurance policy, right, who collects is the spouse. Mm-hmm. And I mean, that's a natural thing to do in your life insurance. You're going to put your spouse. So I'm sure if Michael had died first, then that insurance would have gone to Terri. But the insurance company is not going to pass judgment on the infidelity. They're just going to go by the legal aspect, which is that Michael never divorced Terri. And no one could divorce Terri on her behalf, okay? It's not like the parents couldn't divorce Terri. The parents tried to remove Michael as the legal guardian, but Terri could not divorce Michael once she was in a vegetative state. So it's kind of a catch-22. We just have to believe Michael's version. Very sad that he had gone into that relationship. He's saying, what is he saying? Existentially, he moved on. He knew he couldn't have any more intimacy with his wife. As far as he was concerned, I'm trying to remember the case from back then. He was claiming that as far as he was concerned, once she was declared in a vegetative state, for him, she had died. She had died, and so the marriage was over existentially, even if not legally or ecclesiastically. The marriage was over and he was moving on with his life, but he considered his wife dead, and that's why as far as he was concerned, from his perspective, he had been faithful to her until death did them part. All right, he saw her as dead, and now he just wanted to honor her wishes of disconnecting her. So from that perspective, it does make sense why he didn't follow through legally and ecclesiastically is an unknown. Maybe I really don't know about the depth of their practice of the faith. That's something that has always remained an unknown to me. But I did not know the depth of the practice of the faith. They were Catholic, at least nominally. They married in the Catholic Church. But how deeply were they actually practicing the faith? I don't know.
So when the statement that we were talking about that says, if no comfort to a person who's imminently dying is being given, it's not morally obligated. How do you determine that with the brain activity?
Yes, so they can do an EEG to try to determine what section of the brain is actually working. We know that the conscious decision-making and the more abstract thought and the reasoning occurs mostly on the cortex, on the cerebral cortex, okay? And so that can be measured by an EEG, an electroencephalogram, to see what sector of the brain is more active, or sometimes maybe an MRI or some of those other imaging machines that I talked about earlier, okay, to see what sector of the brain is active and what is not.
I'm sure obviously hers looked like the picture we saw from
yes.
how much go
yes.
with
the vegetative state. Yes, exactly.
But she wasn't able to assimilate nutrition.
Yes, because that's very organic. That's even below the neck. That's at the level of the organs and tissues of the body. And she was able to assimilate because her heart was beating normally. She had a normal pulse, normal heartbeat, and she was breathing normally. And all that requires, that's part of basal metabolism, right? Which requires the nutrition and the hydration necessary to keep it going. But again, being in bed, that's a minimal, which I think is about 1,200 calories to maintain the body alive on a daily basis. It's a bare minimum calorie input.
And the peg was right into her stomach.
Directly to the stomach, exactly. Yeah. And it's a minor surgery, like I say. It's very standard routine procedure, even though it's kind of impressive to have a tube directly into your stomach, but clinically it's very doable. And the maintenance is minimal, just putting the food in, and it doesn't have to be sterilized because our food is not sterilized, right? Okay, so you see, complicated case, all because there was nothing written. So I can't emphasize enough, and our last lecture will be precisely on that, on the documents. The do not resuscitate forms, the living will, which we'll go through. There's a Catholic living will that is respectful of our teaching and incorporates these directives and so forth. Then a power of attorney, the difference between a power of attorney and a durable power of attorney. It's a legal difference between the two. The financial aspect, and then we're going to cover also some other documents that are moving through legislation at different stages. The medical orders and what's it called? Post and most. These are legal documents that are moving through the state legislatures now, which give the medical profession more or less legal power over cases like this. Okay, and there is doubt. So just to wrap again, these 56 through 59 are the key where we see the subjectivity, all right? The moral obligation for ordinary means is 56. The person may forego extraordinary means is 57. Then nutrition and hydration is 58. And then 59 is the free and informed judgment should be honored unless it goes against Catholic teaching. So you can see that it's real, it's delicate, and that's why I say, number one, we should all do a Catholic living will. And number two, beyond that, we should encourage our family and friends to do a Catholic living will, or to at least let us know in the case, God forbid, that you collapse in the middle of the night, what would you like done or not done, okay? As long as it's according to the teachings of the church. So putting euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide aside, would you like to be connected to a peg? Would you like to stay in vegetative state indefinitely or not? Or after certain tests are done, if the prognosis is obviously, if there's a hope of recovery, then that's encouraged. But if the prognosis is nil, what do you want? Delicate conversations to have, important conversations to have, right? Important.
Thank you, Father.
Okay, so that's it. Now we close on this last day. We're going to Holy Week now for our faith. So I wish you a very blessed Holy Week, and especially the Easter Triduum, which will include Holy Saturday next week. So there's no class on Holy Saturday, okay? We'll meet again in 2 weeks, which will be the first Saturday of April. And then we'll go from there. I think we only have maybe 2 more lectures to go, all right? And therefore, if you have any outstanding summaries from this course or from the other course, hand them in as soon as possible because I need to hand in grades too, all right? And so I'm just averaging the summaries, And if there is 0 on that average, it's going to affect the final grade. Okay. Okay, thanks again, and a blessed Easter Triduum to all of you.
So this one is due Wednesday.
This one is due Wednesday of next week, and then you have a week's break there to catch up.
I won't see you for 3 weeks.
You'll be away in
Yes.
another week. Yes. Okay, let me close. Any questions, Diana or anyone else?
No, thank you, Father.
Great. Okay, thanks again. Let me close this. Stop the recording.